These manuscripts have been studied by scholars for almost 80 years, tested with radiocarbon, scanned by computer, and now even artificial intelligence has been brought in to read the handwriting of people who died more than 2,000 years ago. But to this day, no one has answered the simplest question of all: who actually wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? For decades, the answer seemed settled. A sect called the Essenes lived at Qumran, copied scripture, and hid it in the surrounding caves. But when archaeologists went back and dug the same ground again, they found jewelry, perfume bottles, pottery kilns, a water system that may have been built for production, not ritual. Then, artificial intelligence found that one of the most important scrolls, long thought to be the work of a single scribe, may have been written by two. Some scholars have gone even further, questioning whether the Essenes, as we picture them, ever existed at all. The more evidence piles up, the further away the answer gets. And the mystery that still has scholars arguing today began with one missing goat in the Judean desert in the winter of 1946. The new consensus is that the old consensus is dead. That was the assessment of Katerina Garlaw, an archaeologist at Brown University, offered at a conference on the subject back in 2002. She was not being dramatic. She was describing, as plainly as she could manage, the state of a field that has spent more than 70 years trying to answer one question. 11 caves, cut into limestone cliffs the colour of old bone, look down over the flat, mineral-heavy water of the Dead Sea. Inside those caves, roughly 25,000 fragments, the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, pulled out of the Judean desert by a shepherd looking for a lost goat. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most studied ancient manuscripts on the planet. And after 7 decades of study, the scholars who know them best still cannot agree on the answer to the simplest question you could ask about them. Who actually wrote them? This isn't a story about a hidden gospel or a secret someone buried on purpose. Nobody hid anything from you. The people who did the actual digging, the ones who spent their careers on this ground, disagree with each other, in print, by name, and the disagreement has never fully closed. What strikes me most about that fact is how rarely it gets said out loud. Most people who have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls assume the question was settled decades ago. It was not. It still isn't. For most of the 70 years since their discovery, one answer was taught as close to fact. A Jewish sect called the Essenes lived at a site called Qumran on the shore of the Dead Sea and wrote the scrolls there before hiding them in the surrounding caves. That answer has a name and a face, and it belongs to a French Dominican priest named Roland de Vaux. De Vaux, a French Dominican priest, had settled in Jerusalem in the 1930s, and by 1945 was running the École Biblique, a French Catholic school of biblical studies in the city. That position was what put him in charge, in 1951, of excavating a low, sun-bleached ruin above the Dead Sea called Khirbet Qumran. Over 5 seasons, ending in 1956, De Vaux's team found what he took to be the proof he needed. Stepped water pools, which he read as ritual baths. A room containing 2 inkwells and a set of plastered benches, which came to be called from that point on the scriptorium. Here's what I think actually happened in De Vaux's mind, based on what he wrote at the time. He was not inventing a theory out of nothing. Josephus, a first-century historian, had described the Essenes as a community that bathed ritually and dressed only in white. De Vaux looked at his pools, looked at Josephus's centuries-old description, and connected the two. According to De Vaux's own preliminary reports, published across the 1950s, that connection felt, to him, less like a leap and more like a confirmation. And once it was published, it stopped behaving like one archaeologist's interpretation and started behaving like a fact. For decades, textbooks, documentaries, and museum placards repeated it as settled history. Notice what's missing from that chain of repetition, though. At no point did De Vaux himself get to defend the theory in full against a complete accounting of his own evidence, because he never lived to write one. He died in 1971 in Jerusalem, having spent 20 years directing the most consequential archaeological project of his career without ever publishing a final excavation report. His notes, his photographs, his raw field data passed to his successors at the École Biblique. In his 2016 book on the excavation, a later archaeologist named Jean-Baptiste Imbert, De Vaux's own successor at the École Biblique, finally published a fuller account of what those 5 seasons of digging had actually found. What actually kept the theory standing for so long was not any single person guarding it. It was something closer to institutional inertia. A plausible reading published once that then got repeated in textbooks and museum placards long before anyone had the access, the funding, or the professional standing to go back and test it against a full accounting of the evidence. De Vaux himself never saw whether his own conclusions held up, because the complete record of his own dig sat unpublished for over 30 years after his death. That is not, by itself, a story about a careless scholar. It is a story about how quickly one plausible reading of 2 rich baths and a room full of inkwells can calcify into something an entire field teaches as certain, simply because revisiting it is slow, expensive work that nobody had yet done. This wasn't the only time a field would organize itself around one man's interpretation of a handful of physical clues at this exact site. Pull back far enough, and you can see why. Something close to it would happen again, 4 decades on, when 2 other archaeologists, working for the very institution that now oversees the scrolls, went back to the same ground De Vaux had already dug, and came away believing he had missed almost everything that actually mattered. Look at the pattern in what makes De Vaux's case different from a simple case of being wrong. The question nobody quite asks when they repeat his theory today is what the room with the inkwells was actually used for, beyond writing something down at some point. 2 inkwells prove that someone, at some time, wrote in that building. They do not, by themselves, prove who, or what, or how much of what came out of the caves ever passed through it. In my view, that is the detail worth sitting with before we go any further. Not that De Vaux was necessarily wrong, he may well have been right. But the theory that would define this field for 2 generations was locked in before the man who proposed it ever had to answer for the parts of his own evidence he had not yet published. In cases like Qumran, what later gets called consensus can begin as nothing more than the first plausible interpretation to organize the evidence. Repeated so often, it stops sounding like an interpretation at all. It's worth being fair to that interpretation too. The ritual baths and the room with the inkwells were never the entire case for an Essene community at Qumran. Other evidence, textual and physical, would later be added to it. But they became the physical centerpiece of the version handed to the public, the 2 objects most documentaries reached for first. That is exactly why they carried more weight than 2 artifacts should ever have to carry alone. De Vaux gave the story its shape. He gave it a sect, a settlement, and a scriptorium. What he did not give it, because he died before he could, was a final word. What this tells us, before the ground even gets disturbed a second time, is how easily silence gets mistaken for certainty. And in the space his silence left behind, an entire discipline built a consensus on an interpretation that had never been fully tested against its own excavators' complete notes. A pattern this particular patch of desert would repeat. Among the soil and pottery fragments at Qumran, two archaeologists working through the early 1990s kept finding objects that did not belong in the accepted picture of the site. Jewellery, perfume bottles, imported ceramics, combs, small things individually, sitting in soil that was supposed to belong to some of the poorest, most ascetic people in the ancient world. The two archaeologists were named Yitzhak Magen and Yuval Peleg, and neither was there to prove anyone wrong. Magen held the post of staff officer for archaeology in the region at the time, working for the Israel Antiquities Authority. That is the same government body that today conserves and treats every one of the roughly 25,000 Dead Sea Scroll fragments in laboratories in Jerusalem. Together, over close to a decade of renewed digging that ran from 1993 into the mid-2000s, Magen and the younger Peleg kept adding to that list of out-of-place objects. None of it fit the picture that had defined this site for 40 years. That picture belonged to a poor, celibate religious community called the Essenes, living simply at Qumran and copying scripture in a dedicated writing room. It had come from a French priest named Roland de Vaux, who excavated the same ground in the 1950s and never lived to publish a final report on what he had found. Here's what I think actually mattered most in what Magen and Peleg dug up. It wasn't any single object. It was the pattern the objects made together. Tens of thousands of pottery fragments, a pool coated in a thick layer of potter's clay, a water system that had been tripled in size at some point in the site's history for a reason no one had ever fully explained. Magen and Peleg's answer was not romantic. They argued the site had functioned for at least part of its life as a pottery production centre, an industrial operation, not a monastery. Notice what that explanation does to the earlier one. If the water system existed to process clay rather than to fill ritual baths, two of de Vaux's central pillars get shakier. The baths and the mysterious room with the inkwells he had called a scriptorium start to look less like proof of a religious sect. They start to look more like ordinary infrastructure that got a spiritual reading layered onto it after the fact. Population is where the disagreement gets sharpest. De Vaux's excavation had supported estimates of as many as 200 residents at Qumran, enough to imagine a functioning religious community large enough to produce the scale of writing found in the caves. Magen and Peleg's renewed excavation could not support anything close to that. Their reading of the site's residential space suggested no more than a few dozen people at any given time. Records show that the two archaeologists eventually published their full findings in a final report on nearly a decade of digging, laying out coin counts, pottery types, and structural measurements in detail de Vaux's own preliminary papers never reached. If you ask me, that gap, 200 against a few dozen, is the real headline here, more than any single artifact. An entire theory about who copied a library of nearly 1,000 manuscripts rests, in part, on how many people you believe could have lived on that patch of ground at once. Pull back from the individual numbers for a moment, and a larger question comes into view. How much of what gets taught as archaeological fact is really just the first interpretation that nobody had the resources to test for another 40 years? This particular patch of desert was about to answer that question again. What actually let the older number stand unquestioned for so long was not any one person protecting it. It was institutional inertia. Careers, textbooks, and museum exhibits had all been built on the older reading. Testing it meant funding a fresh excavation, reopening ground that had already been declared understood, and, if the results came back the way Maguen and Peleg's did, unsettling decades of accumulated teaching, not just one dead priest's field notes. Maguen and Peleg were the ones who actually did that work. They went back into ground de Vaux had already dug, working for the very institution that had inherited his legacy, and came away arguing that the founding theory of an entire field of study did not survive contact with a fuller excavation. This wasn't the first time a founding excavation turned out to have left more questions open than its own excavator ever realized. What strikes me most is how ordinary the objects at the center of the reversal actually were. Not a hidden inscription, not a forged document. Jewelry, pottery. A water system a few sizes too large for the story it was supposedly serving. There is one important thing this newer excavation did not do, and it is worth being precise about it. Maguen and Peleg's findings did not prove that no one at Qumran ever wrote or handled a scroll. In my view, what they showed was narrower and in some ways more unsettling. The specific evidence de Vaux had used to build his picture of a devout, impoverished scribal community does not, on its own, hold up the weight that picture has been asked to carry for 70 years. Yuval Peleg died in 2014 while excavating a cave in a different part of the region. Yitzhak Maguen has continued working since, still one of the most active voices arguing that this quiet ruin above the Dead Sea was never the monastery it was made out to be. Look at the pattern this leaves behind. The disagreement he helped open has not closed. If anything, it set the stage for an even wider argument, one that does not just ask what Qumran was, but whether the sect said to have lived there ever existed in the way anyone assumed. Most people who have heard of the Essenes assume there are only two possibilities left standing. Either the Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, the way generations of textbooks have said, or nobody knows who did, and the question has simply gone cold. Neither of those is true. At least 4 influential positions have been seriously defended in the scholarly literature, and one of them argues that the Essenes, as most people picture them, may never have existed in the first place. Start with the position that still holds the most ground. The majority of scholars in this field continue to accept some version of what is called the Qumran-Essene hypothesis. The idea is that a Jewish sect, described by the 1st century writer Josephus and briefly by Pliny the Elder, is the same group whose sectarian writings turn up again and again among the scrolls. According to a 2011 study by Orit Shamir, a textile curator with the Israel Antiquities Authority, working with Naama Sukenik, then a graduate student at Bar Ilan University, nearly 200 textile fragments recovered from the caves were examined in detail. Every one of them was plain, undyed linen, not the wool that was far more common in the region at the time, except for the wrappers actually used to bind the scrolls themselves, which carried a deliberate blue-dyed pattern. That is not proof by itself, but it is, at minimum, consistent with an ancient description of a plain-dressed, deliberately modest community, exactly the kind Josephus wrote about. Its weakness is the same as any argument built on lifestyle rather than a signed name. Plenty of modest, white linen-wearing groups could have existed in ancient Judea without being the specific sect Josephus described. Here's what complicates that picture, though, and it comes from inside the very evidence the majority position relies on. A scholar named Steve Mason, one of the leading specialists on Josephus's actual writing, published an argument in 2008 that the parallels between Josephus's description of the Essenes and what shows up in the scrolls are weaker, on close reading, than most people assume. He was not proposing an alternative author. He was questioning whether the strongest piece of outside evidence for the majority view is as solid as it has been treated for decades. 3 other scholars published a direct rejoinder the following year, arguing that despite Mason's concerns, Josephus remains the best evidence available for the connection. Notice what that back and forth actually proves. The disagreement was never resolved. It simply sits there, unresolved, inside the foundation of the leading theory. Then there is the position that does not just question the evidence, but rejects the whole picture of who lived at the site. Norman Golb, the historian at the University of Chicago, who spent much of his career on this question, argued from the 1980s until his death in 2020 that the scrolls were never the library of one isolated desert sect at all. In his view, they represent the collected writings of multiple Jewish communities across Jerusalem, moved out to the caves for safekeeping as the Roman army closed in on the city in the year 70. His strongest evidence was negative. No scroll or fragment has ever been found at the settlement itself, only in the surrounding caves, which fits a hiding place better than it fits a scriptorium. Its weakness is that it explains the caves without fully explaining the settlement. Golb's theory does not need Qumran to have housed a religious community of any kind, but it also does not account for why a purely secular way station would need the water system and structures found there. Now for the position that goes furthest of all, and it deserves the most care in how it gets told. Rachel Elior, a Hebrew University scholar, has argued, in her study of the scrolls, that they originated somewhere else entirely. Not with a separatist desert sect, but with a specific group of Jerusalem temple priests, from the house of Zadok, pushed out of power roughly a century and a half before the Common Era. Elior goes a step beyond that. She has argued that Josephus effectively invented the Essenes as a literary description, modelled in part on Greek accounts of Spartan life, and that no such sect ever existed in the way the ancient sources describe. That claim has not gone unanswered. James Charlesworth, who directs the Dead Sea Scrolls project at Princeton Theological Seminary, has pushed back directly. He points out that it is not plausible for Josephus to have invented a group already mentioned independently by Philo of Alexandria, a writer who had personally visited Jerusalem and was in no position to simply copy Josephus's account. If you ask me, that exchange is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows something the loudest version of this story always leaves out. Even the most radical position in this field gets tested in public, by name, against a real counter-argument. Nothing here goes unchallenged for long. The way I read this whole tangle of positions is not that the scrolls are somehow suspicious or that their sacred content is in doubt. Nothing about disputing who copied these texts changes what they actually say or what they have meant for 2,000 years to the people who read them as scripture. The argument is entirely about authorship and origin. about which human hands did the physical work of writing and hiding these manuscripts, not about the truth or meaning of the words themselves. That distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about it before going any further. In my view, the most honest way to hold all four of these positions at once is to read between the competing footnotes rather than pick a side by instinct. Look at who has something to lose across these four positions, because it is not who you would expect. It is not a hidden institution protecting a secret. It is decades of individual scholarly reputation, built one publication at a time, on an interpretation that in some cases has never been tested against a full accounting of the evidence. Every one of these four camps is defended, in print, by named academics willing to stake their careers on it. That is not the profile of a cover-up. It is the profile of a field that has never actually reached the consensus it is so often assumed to have already reached. Three things stand out to me across all four positions, if you pull back far enough to see them together. First, that the strongest evidence on every side is physical and textual, not speculative. Second, that every single challenge to the majority view has come from inside the profession, from people who spent years or decades on this exact material, not from outsiders looking to score a point. Third, and this is the one that should stay with you, a question this well studied, with this much physical evidence, can still resist a final answer, simply because the evidence itself was never going to be clean enough to force one. What this tells us, before we even reach the physical science of dating these manuscripts, is something worth carrying forward. A plausible story can carry enormous weight simply because it arrived first. And it can carry that weight for a very long time, right up until someone finally has the standing to test it out loud, in public, against their own colleagues. Four named positions, four sets of evidence, and a field still, after 70 years, arguing about every one of them. There is a scroll more than 7 meters long, catalogued as the Great Isaiah Scroll, held today in a climate-controlled vault in Jerusalem. 54 columns of Hebrew text, copied out by hand more than 2,000 years ago, containing the earliest complete copy of the Book of Isaiah known to exist anywhere. For 70 years, scholars staring at its columns suspected something odd about the handwriting, without being able to prove it. In 2021, a professor named Mladen Popovic, who directs the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen, published an answer, working with a computer scientist named Lambert Schoemaker and a researcher named Maruf Dali. Using pattern recognition and artificial intelligence rather than the human eye alone, their study, published that year, identified a clear transition point around columns 27 to 29, where the handwriting style shifts. Two scribes, not one, sharing a training or origin close enough that no reader had ever been able to separate them just by looking. Here's what strikes me about how Popovic described the moment his own team confirmed it. He said that after 70 years of study, identifying these anonymous scribes through their handwriting finally felt like being able to shake hands with them. Lambert Schoemaker put the scale of the underlying problem more plainly. The scroll alone contains the Hebrew letter Aleph roughly 5,000 times. Far too many instances for any human being to compare by eye with total confidence. The computer did not replace the scholar's judgment. It gave that judgment something to check itself against. 4 years later, the same team turned the same tools toward an even older problem: dating the scrolls themselves. In 2025, Popovich led an international group that published a study introducing an artificial intelligence model they named Enoch. The model does not measure a manuscript's age directly. It was trained on 24 scroll samples that had already been physically dated using radiocarbon analysis. From those samples, it learned to associate handwriting style with age. It then estimates a probable date range for a new sample by comparing its handwriting against everything the model learned from those 24. According to the published study, Enoch's estimates carried an average margin of error of under 31 years, a striking level of precision for material this old, given that it is reading style, not measuring decay. Notice what this new method also exposed about the old one. Popovich pointed to a specific, avoidable problem in earlier radiocarbon results. Castor oil, applied by scholars back in the 1950s to make faded text easier to read, had acted as a modern contaminant. It quietly skewed decades of radiocarbon dates toward periods more recent than the manuscript's actual age. Records show that when the team applied Enoch to over 130 previously undated fragments, paleography experts judged its age estimates realistic in the large majority of cases. The results shifted the overall picture of the collection's timeline. Several scrolls now appear to date 50 to 150 years earlier than long assumed, pushing the oldest examples in the entire collection back into the 4th century before the Common Era. You might think this is a purely academic correction, a matter of a few decades one way or the other. It isn't only that. If a text is genuinely older than its traditional dating assumed, the ideas inside it were circulating earlier than historians had built their timelines around. The sequence in which certain religious and philosophical concepts actually developed has to be reconsidered rather than assumed. This wasn't the first time a new scientific method arrived at Qumran promising to settle an old argument, only to open a new one instead. That pattern alone is worth noticing before we even get to the specifics. Some scholars remain skeptical of results that would place certain texts, including material connected to the Book of Daniel, earlier than the historical events those texts appear to describe. Lambert Schomacher himself has acknowledged the core vulnerability directly. Anyone who already doubts the underlying radiocarbon dates will have no particular reason to trust an artificial intelligence model that was trained on those same disputed dates. The tool is only as convincing as the data it learned from. The question nobody can fully answer yet is whether a model built this way can ever be independent enough of its own training data to actually resolve the doubts it was built to settle. Look at the pattern underneath that disagreement, because it isn't reputation for its own sake that's at stake. It's the entire discipline of paleography, the practice of dating ancient handwriting purely by eye and experience, a skill built up over a working lifetime by individual scholars. In my view, that is the real tension worth sitting with. If a machine trained on a few dozen samples can match or outperform decades of trained human judgment, that raises an uncomfortable question for the field, and not only this one. How much of what experts call intuition can be reduced to a pattern a computer was never taught to feel, only to count? Sound familiar? The same tension between hard-won human expertise and a machine trained to spot patterns invisible to the eye is playing out across research fields far beyond this desert right now. Here, at least, the disagreement is being conducted the way it should be, in published studies, with named authors, arguing openly about where the uncertainty actually lives. No result from either study proves who copied these scrolls, or why. What this tells us instead is something narrower and in its own way more remarkable. They let two anonymous scribes dead for over 2,000 years become individually visible again, and they let a set of manuscripts argue, on physical grounds, for their own age. The question of authorship remains as open as it was when Roland de Vaux first stepped onto this ground in 1951. But the tools for asking it have changed completely. How do you prove who wrote a text when everyone who could answer with certainty has been dead for 2,000 years, and all that survives is the handwriting? If you ask me, that is the question sitting underneath every excavation, every textile study, and every artificial intelligence model this story has touched. And as of this recording, a new, better-funded attempt to answer it has only just begun. In the summer of 2026, the European Research Council awarded a grant worth roughly €2.5 million to Mladen Popovic, the same scholar behind the scribal and dating studies, for a 5-year project titled Tracing Scribes and Scrolls. It is a partnership between the University of Groningen, the Israel Antiquities Authority, and a group of additional European research laboratories. In my view, its ambition goes further than anything attempted on this material before. Not simply identifying individual scribes or narrowing a manuscript's date, but tracing where each scroll was actually written, what materials its scribes used, and what networks of learning connected one writing centre to another across ancient Judea. According to the project's own announcement, researchers plan to analyse roughly 250 samples of parchment, papyrus and ink, combining chemical analysis with artificial intelligence, paleography, and the physical study of the manuscripts themselves. Popovic has called it the largest research effort yet undertaken to understand the cultural world behind these scrolls. No results have been published yet. The project is just beginning. Look at the pattern that leaves us with. After nearly 80 years of study, the most fundamental question about the Dead Sea Scrolls is not closed history. It is an open case file, with new investigators only now walking in the door. Picture, for a moment, the room where roughly 25,000 fragments of this collection are kept today. A climate-controlled laboratory in Jerusalem, fragments laid flat under glass, gloved hands and raking light doing the work that a shepherd's curious hands did by accident in a cave in the winter of 1946. What strikes me is how completely the tools have changed, and how little the underlying question has moved. Here's what I think this entire story actually teaches, more than any single camp or any single scroll. It is not that experts cannot be trusted, or that the past is unknowable. It is closer to the opposite. A question can survive contact with de Vaux' excavation, with Margan and Peleg's pottery kilns, with 4 competing scholarly camps, with artificial intelligence trained on ancient ink, and still remain, honestly, open. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is what scholarship looks like when it refuses to pretend a question is settled before the evidence has actually settled it. Notice what none of the 4 camps we walked through ever needed to do. Not one of them had to invent a scribe, a document, or a saying that was not already sitting in the archaeological record. The disagreement is real, and in places it gets personal, but every side of it is built out of things that actually exist. What this tells us about these particular manuscripts is something worth sitting with long after this recording ends. The Dead Sea Scrolls have survived floods, empires, 40 years of an unpublished excavation report, and now a machine built specifically to read handwriting the human eye cannot fully separate. Through every one of those tests, the texts themselves have not moved. Pull back far enough, and what has actually moved, again and again, is only our confidence about who first set them down. There is a kind of respect owed to a mystery that refuses to resolve itself simply because we would find it more convenient if it did. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.